Hey Jigsaw, thanks again for stopping by. If you're new to the channel, my name is Riley and I'm a former Jehovah's Witness. And today I have the great honor to be joined by Geoffrey Wallis. Geoffrey is a PIMO Jehovah's Witness who has written a book called A Voice from the Inside, and I had the pleasure of reading it recently, and we're going to have a discussion with Geoffrey about his book. So I'll just add Geoffrey to the stream. Hi, Geoffrey. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Riley. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate the opportunity.
No, I appreciate you accepting the invitation. Thank you so much. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm doing good.
Great.
Thank you. Although I see my logo isn't up on the screen here, which I'm sad about now.
Oh no.
but
oh, that's a shame.
Well, I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes or something.
Oh, absolutely. I definitely will.
Cool.
Great. So please tell us a bit about your book and what motivated you to write it.
Yeah. So, I sort of experienced, well, the book really is about religious trauma and a bit from a bit more of like a clinical perspective in terms of what it looks like to have such a all-encompassing faith crisis in the context of a high-demand religious group like Jehovah's Witnesses, and the theology that contributes to the situation and how serious it can get when it leads to an experience like PTSD. So, I sort of went through this cognitive change, what we call awakening, what ExJW's Witnesses call awakening, and had settled on a place that I thought was comfortable for me as a PIMO. And so I just kind of went to the personal project of writing a book because it's always been something I wanted to do. And my book consultant said, well, you need to think about your pain and then talk about that as your starting point and your recovery. So that led to pulling together a lot of research that I had done on religious trauma over the years, and also, as you know, copious research into Watchtower publications over the years as a Jehovah's Witness. So all that came together in an effort to bring more awareness to the precariousness of individuals as they come out of indoctrination and start to plot their course.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And one thing that stood out to me when I read the book was the open letter to the governing body. It was really, really well written. You hit some really important points. But I just want to ask, are you hoping that the governing body reforms the organization or the religion? What was your motivation behind writing that open letter?
It really is to get leadership to think about some of what I see are key policies, captive policies, that are so detrimental to psychological well-being within the group. And so I recognize it's a beloved faith for many people, and religion does fill that psychological need above and beyond Jehovah's Witnesses, obviously. So, however, there are some key policies and key ethical violations that I think really need to be given some consideration to, and that would free up the boundaries of the group, so that there would be less of a totalist environment, less of this cognitive atmosphere where individuals feel unsafe to express or think freely, which is where, individuals get some of those terms like brainwashing and things like that. So by just making some alterations, at least it would allow some freedom of thought, allow people to make decisions that are in their interest based on their personal values. And also particularly in terms of my self-interest, give religious freedom back to PIMOs. So individuals who were active members of the group, who no longer believe the tenets of the organization now, do not have the freedom to exit the group, to speak freely without losing their cherished friendships or relationships with family. And that is a restriction on their liberties that needs to be checked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great. What you just expressed there really strikes a chord with me personally. Something that's been a main feature of my activism since I started out on YouTube was that I have no real burning desire to see the organization collapse. If it did, I wouldn't shed too many tears, but that isn't really the objective behind my activism. I'm just against seeing people harmed by religion. I'm not against religion itself.
Yeah.
So,
And that's the funny thing is when you're inside and obviously I haven't done a lot of, well, I mean, I've read some literature, sort of ExJW literature, and, I see quite a bit online now since I've come up on social media. But the reality is you are raised with the understanding that that's exactly what apostates want to do, that they want to tear down something that is cherished, something that has taken years to build. And I'm happy to hear you say that, because that was another reason that I felt very nervous to step out and speak my own thoughts, because you can imagine being rejected by outsiders too, because of not having an extent of hatred for the group that would be understandable by pained individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not to diminish the anger and the pain and the negative feelings that many have towards the organization for very, very good reasons.
Absolutely.
But as you expressed, religion does provide some people with a lot of comfort psychologically. Whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs is for each individual to decide for themselves.
There you go.
Yeah, personally, I'm just against the harm that some religions and some religious practices cause, not religion itself as an entity.
And that's good it's good that you do frame it as harm. I mean, I think that's a good word to use, because as Jehovah's Witnesses, we are fixated on right and wrong. We're fixated on morality, not only on individual morality, but also sort of like global, sweeping, universal morality. And so that is a difficult paradigm to break and not think so universally all the time. But as you say, regardless of where one ends up standing on ethical, considerations, values, morals, religion, we still can recognize that harm is done. And we can still recognize that an individual in this situation is in a state, and my focus is on clinical mental health, so is in a state where they are going to need a unique approach so that they can be assisted to move past this crisis. It cannot be dismissed. I think it's easy to dismiss it as a faith crisis that is perhaps in looser religious organizations, but when your entire social network is tied up and there has been this level of weaving personal life into a religious framework, it brings it to a new level that can really be dangerous. Yeah. So harm is a good word.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a part in the book that really piqued my interest. It was when you were referencing the Australian Royal Commission and a phrase used by Angus Stewart, who did a brilliant job in the Australian Royal Commission, by the way. And that phrase was a captive organization. Could you just give us some background on what you understand by that phrase and how it applies to the Jehovah's Witness religion?
Yeah, I thought it was a fresh phrase because as Jehovah's Witnesses, you're used to being called a cult. You're used to being, being told you're brainwashed. And so you have some pretty standard responses to that. You have a copy of the reasoning on the scriptures and you flip to the page that says cult, and then you say what it says. And you can tell a Jehovah's Witness they're in a cult all day, and it's useless in terms of helping them see their cognitive biases, their sort of psychological biases, right?
Yeah.
But when I saw those proceedings and I read those proceedings, the use of the term captive organization, I felt sort of got away from some of that other language that is kind of tired, that we've heard so much. Not that it's not useful, but at least for me, it wasn't doing anything. But when I heard captive organization, I thought that's really what my situation is right now as a PIMO, is a level of captivity. And so Angus Stewart, he's speaking with Geoffrey Jackson, member of the governing body, and trying to follow this line of reasoning to where an individual is sometimes faced, and when speaking in the context of child sexual abuse, he's speaking, asking Geoffrey Jackson to put his feet in the shoes of a victim of sexual abuse. And basically he's saying, if this individual chose to remove themselves from the presence of their abuser, who may still be in the congregation, namely by leaving the congregation, to get to a place where they feel safe away from their abuser, they will face shunning because they will in effect be disassociating as a Jehovah's Witness. And the other option is that they remain and not feel safe. So they're kind of in this situation where they are very much captive. So you have the choice to disfellowship. You can do something and be punitively excommunicated from the group, or you can choose that you no longer want to be a Jehovah's Witness, disassociate, and also be punitively shunned by the group. So there is no dignified exit. And particularly when it comes to child sexual abuse, that's a dangerous situation, which that court identified, that was not a healthy arrangement. But, extending that to individuals in general, when it comes to the level of captivity there. And moving on from there in the book, I highlight psychological captivity and procedural captivity. So the theological, the psychology of the religion that is captive, that makes individuals captive, unable to think freely at times. And then also the procedures that are in place that create an atmosphere of captivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is those theological and procedural captivity, how has that impacted on you personally?
Well, the deconstructing of the theology is a very liberating process when you do sort of look at it from the angle of how is my creative thought affected by what I'm reading in the scriptures. And I should say in the scriptures, in what Jehovah's Witnesses teaches the scriptures, and also in the literature. So, there are elements of Christian theology that are disempowering in general, and they are enforced at the expense of other viewpoints in Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization. So whereas mainstream Christians can maybe pick and choose, or they have an external voice, they have maybe a more secular voice that they're hearing and that may be respected either in the community or maybe even in the family. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, there is only that theological style of thinking. There is no outside voice. So, but I use Lifton's framework for thought reform. So Robert Lifton was a researcher in the 60s that kind of discovered this psychological phenomenon that happens in closed groups, right? And he was studying the Chinese Communist Party and how they used this concept of thought reform. It was actually a program of indoctrination and education, and what that did to psychology on the individual level. And so he identified 8 different criteria that we can see in closed religious groups. And I argue that you can see them in Jehovah's Witnesses, and I give evidence of those things in the literature and in the experience of a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, I found that part of the book absolutely fascinating. I'm really, really interested in Lifton's work, and he coined the term ideological totalism.
That's right.
Which is very, very apt in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, and also within many other socio-political groups today. I think it's a very, very relevant concept, and I'd advise anybody to to look at his work, especially coming from a high control religion or political group.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. It's not to point a finger necessarily at one group. It's just something that happens to humans when they get together and they organize themselves in a certain way. There's sort of certain, this plays upon certain tendencies of human dynamics, you know, but yeah, there's a line there's a threshold there to where it really becomes a situation that follows this pattern, becomes very easily identifiable, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get on to some of the research that you've done in order to write the book. But before we do that, I think there's some comments by the way, viewers, if you have any questions for Geoffrey, please feel free to write them in the comment section, and we'll take a few breaks and answer some of those. Are there any comments or questions? Thank you very much. Oh, I must thank my producer, Marsha, who's putting these comments on. Thank you very much for doing that. Okay, so there's one from ExJW UK, Anita, who is a very long time supporter of the channel. Thank you, Anita. I hope you're doing well. As an ExJW, I just want religious freedom and children protected within the organization. Yeah, I completely agree with that, with those sentiments. And I'm sure you do as well, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Chrissy, thank you. Another value supporter. They're a secret society. Well, a good old boys club anyway.
I think it's funny you mention, I recognize, and I don't know, Riley, if you ever served as an elder.
No, I didn't.
Okay, so I started to realize as I broke away from the group that the experience for an individual who is an elder or perhaps heavily involved in other ways, whether, you know, through what they call theocratic schools and missionaries and things like this, their experience is quite different than that of the rank and file. I think that the level of commitment and the sort of loss of oneself into what could be considered like groupthink or social polarization is even more extreme for bodies of elders. And so, you know, we call it a good old boys club, but you are in a group of men who are tasked with the responsibility of, you know, executing the decisions from the governing body and from the organization, and also caring for the sheep as they consider it. They consider it a spiritual, sort of a nurturing spiritual work. And so they become disciplinarians. And they also, you know, speaking as someone who was an elder, I greatly valued actually what I viewed as a very noble work to care for others spiritually. I had overstepped healthy bounds there into the realm of manipulation, into the realm of coercion, right? But being in those bodies, I know how seriously those men take the responsibility of caring for the spirituality of the sheep. And that is a very strange sort of emotional experience to be able to communicate, because so many people have been hurt by that same paternalistic influence. So that good old boys club is perhaps a little bit dismissive of my experience as an elder, but there's some real reality to what happens.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, when I was waking up, one of the channels that I first started like binge watching was by a former elder. And he said that it was being an elder that started to wake him up, because he got to see a side of the organization that he would have had no idea of if not for that. And I'm, like I said, I was never appointed. But I'm certain that if I ever was appointed and became an elder, it would have woken me up a lot sooner as well.
I think a lot of people, and I remember my first elders meeting, and I've heard of the experience from others. It is this, I talk about it a bit in the book too. I think like it's a rough waking up to what's going on and to this new role that you have, you know? So there was this curtain that you could not see past. as a layperson into what's going on in that back room with those elders, the decisions. They never give thorough explanations of what happens. Apparently some mystical spiritual thing happens in those elders meetings that they come back to the group with. And then you step in and you're in that group. And so there's like normal politicizing that happens in groups of decision makers. And you see that, and it's rough. There's sort of, I think, as you say, a moment where some are besotted with their new privilege, because in the group this is a momentous occasion, becoming an elder. Your friends celebrate and everyone pats you on the back, and you've finally done a great job. You've been working on this for years and months and years. So they're besotted with this new privilege, and then they're also facing the sort of brutal realities of what's going on. And yeah, I can understand how that would wake somebody up, but I also understand how it would cause them to double down. And I think that's what we probably see more is, so this young, a young man who is, spiritual, not sort of maybe aware of some of the harsher realities of the world. We could say naive. This was my experience. Becomes an elder. I become an elder, and then you see all this, and there's a doubling down, a recommitment. Okay, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm really going to do it. And then other men in the congregation will sort of take you under their wing and give you their spiritual workarounds for why it's okay for you to do this or that, and why this is still in line with what the organization is asking you to do. Yeah. So I think two things could happen, as you say. People could wake up, or there can be a recapitulation, a doubling down, an even further loss of self there in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I'd had a lot of assistance from elders for various things over the course of my time as a Jehovah's Witness. And towards the end, there was one elder in particular, and I honestly felt that he wanted to help me in ways that he was unable to due to the restrictions of his office, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah.
And I kind of got the sense that was a frustration to him. Did you ever feel like that when you were an elder?
No, not for the most part, because I was really, I really did feel like everything that we had in our little Shepherd the Flock of God book was in fact from God Almighty. So, I never sort of had that other voice yearning in terms of helping other people. It's like, well, this is this is kind of how it is. This is for their best. This is in their best interest. That minimizing of personal empathy for others. But I do think that that's very true what you say, because in a sense they're sort of like middlemen here. They're given the instructions, and they're very fearful. A lot of times, elders lack decision-making ability. And this happens on judicial committees where they are trying to make a decision about what needs to be done, and the rule book isn't explicit enough. And so they end up having to put it in abeyance until they call headquarters and get an answer from headquarters on what to do. And they sort of will, they usually don't make the decision for you. They'll like hold back and sort of guide you to a group decision, but still put the decision-making authority on the elders. But the point is that there's a real challenge there when men struggle with their sort of natural desire to be more kind to people, but they're held to the information that's in the books. Yeah. So sometimes, one thing that sticks out to me, which was really difficult for me, and what I see as from a mental health point of view as particularly worrisome, is the acknowledgement of how judicial proceedings can cause someone to mention suicide. So it's specifically mentioned in the elders book, if the guilty party says they're thinking of suicide, pause, don't move further, try and help them regain their spiritual balance, and then proceed again. And there was a time when at another place in the book, it said that elders were not to recommend specific mental health resources to rank and file witnesses. In the most recent copy of the book, that's no longer there, but for many years it was. So you have the situation where elders are creating an environment that can cause an individual so much shame that they want to end their life, but then also are told organizationally not to provide resources for mental health help.
Yeah.
That is a real bind there, because the only people that you go to for spiritual comfort are also stopped from giving you an external, somebody with more ethical training and more professional training to help people get out of mental health crises.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that isn't causing harm, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I can't think of any worse situation. I mean,
it's a shame to have it, well, I'm using the word shame. I don't like to use that, but I mean, it's really troublesome to have an organizational policy like the judicial arrangement and disfellowshipping that is causing people to get to the point where they would want to take their lives. You have to really sit with that for a bit and ask yourself, whether that can be adjusted in a way that's more healthy for people, and that's what leadership needs to do, really, is just say, okay, well, do we need to go this far? It would be really scary to undo disfellowshipping. I think frightening, threatening for leadership, because it would loosen the bounds of the religion, and surely some would exit. Yeah. Surely.
Absolutely.
The sort of paradoxical thing about this is you could see growth in Jehovah's Witnesses, because it would then be less of a risky environment to be in. So that's sort of paradox there. But I think about what it would take for leadership, for like the governing body, to how do you spin it as new light that we're going to stop shunning and disfellowshipping? How do you spin that? And I think there's ways to do it, but it would take a lot of courage on their part. And that's what I speak to in that letter to the governing body, is this is going to take courage for you to take accountability for what's going on, and then prevent further abuse. It's going to be really challenging for them to do that, but it's not a task that can't be done. It's not a task that can't be done.
Yeah, I agree. So if we can just talk a little bit about the research that you've done for the book. So speaking from my own experience, when I started waking up, I completely dove headfirst into a rabbit hole of researching the religion, its origins, past teachings, a lot of things that I had no idea of whatsoever. When it came to your own experience of waking up, which came first? All of that research for the book, or did you do that research as part of like your waking up journey and then incorporated it into the book?
Most of the research for the book was after, because sure enough, I was determined not to go the way of every apostate and read apostate literature. So I sure enough did not touch any critical voices of the organization. So when it comes to waking up, I was dealing with some other real just conflicts. And I was doing a lot of learning. I'd kind of reached a point where there was no more reading of Jehovah's Witnesses literature that I could do. I had sort of read it all. I had reached the point where I had to read other stuff, and so I started just dipping into popular psychology books, just stuff that was interesting to me. And it brought up a lot of cognitive dissonance as I started to realize so much of this was in conflict with what I experienced, what I thought was the truth. And so that created, as I fought against that external information, it created some real psychological conflict, which was leading to depression and anxiety, trying to push out all these thoughts that didn't match with what I had been taught all my life, right?
Yeah.
So that was in the years leading up to my awakening. But in terms of the book itself, that was after I had experienced the onset of trauma. And so I was experiencing PTSD, and I was starting to recover, and I was learning about religious trauma. And that led me to, works like The Trumpet of Prophecy, which was written by James Beckford. He was not a Jehovah's Witness, but he was a sociologist that, researched Jehovah's Witnesses. And I tried to stick really with academic literature, again, because I was really afraid of being swayed in terms of my opinion. I wanted to see if I could get really unbiased information, if at all possible. So I read that, and I read George Cressidi's work, which is a textbook. He's a British scholar, and he was embedded with the congregation. I think he knows them really well. You can tell he really knows a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses. But I do think there were some points about the psychology that he didn't pick up on. Of course, I think because he is more of a religious scholar than a psychology of religion scholar. So he wasn't really talking so much about the individual experiences of people. So I read a bunch of that literature, and I was poking around and collecting it all. And then when it was time to read the book, it all found its place in the book, basically.
Cool. Good. Yeah. So could you tell us a bit about what it was like, your first experience looking at material from, or quote unquote, apostate material? Mm-hmm. That's a question that I'm keen to ask almost everyone that I speak to, because of what a profound experience it was for me. I'm just curious to know what it's like for everyone else.
For me, there was a lot of fear involved. So I started recognizing what my religious fear looked like, felt like experientially, right? So actually, before I started reading any of this external information, I knew that I had to make a change in terms of my work, because I was in a position where I was relying on the organization for, finances. And so I had to make a change where I had to sort of learn a new skill. And I was experiencing a lot of intrusive thoughts about being materialistic, which is a theme that is just pounded into Jehovah's Witnesses through the literature. Individuals that get haughty and arrogant and, seek higher learning so they can get fancy, respectable jobs. And it's because they're not humble and they don't have faith in God. So I was hearing a lot of that. I was experiencing a lot of that as I was trying to learn a new skill, which was getting in the way of me mastering a new skill. But it did teach me the origin of my sort of religious fears and what that experience was like. So then when I did get to reading external literature and literature from ExWitnesses like Crisis of Conscience, and also the Gentile Times Reconsidered, I noticed that as I sort of edged closer to finally reading it, I was overwhelmed with fear. But the fear was actually, to me, it was an indication of something I needed to sit with and experience. In psychology, they call this exposure therapy.
Yeah.
If you're afraid of spiders, you start with a picture of a spider and you get afraid, and the therapist is there and you sit and you breathe through it. Next, you get a plastic spider and you sit and breathe through it, and the fear response happens. And then finally, if you've managed your fear response, or learn how to manage your fear response, you can hold the spider in your hand and be okay with it. Right. So it was something similar. I felt like I was doing a form of exposure therapy on ideas that didn't match with the theology. I knew that I was experiencing fear because of being a bad person, being disfellowshipped from my family, et cetera, et cetera. And I had to just sit with that fear and keep reading and experience the fear again. Sometimes panic inducing. Learning new information was like literally panic inducing. But I knew that there was no reason why information had to be that threatening to me. And if it was that threatening to me, then there's a piece of the puzzle I didn't understand yet.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's take a few questions. We're actually being inundated with questions for you, Jeff. I hope you don't mind. So Outside the Box asks, hi, Geoffrey, you are a PIMO. If now one of your congregation members recognizes your voice, would elders disfellowship you?
I don't know. I know that this is obviously the risk that I take speaking out. It causes me a lot of distress. One thing I do know is that most Jehovah's Witnesses don't watch Jexit 2020. So I think there's a level of anonymity provided there. But that's a risk. That is definitely a risk.
Yeah.
And, the one thing I know the rules pretty well. I know that I know how to play that game.
Yeah. Well, I must say that I do admire your courage for taking that risk anyway and using your voice. Yeah. Okay, we do have another question from TW. Why do you think COs and DOs that come out rarely give tell-all interviews about Watchtower? Do you think they have signed a non-disclosure agreement? That's a really interesting question.
I don't think so. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences and never been asked to sign a non-disclosure. I think there's a number of reasons why people don't speak out. In terms of the cult experience and people who are traumatized by like spiritual abuse, it's really hard because there's a real vulnerability to say, like, I got wrapped up in this. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was hoodwinked and duped by the used car salesman, and I'm not worldly wise enough or savvy enough to have stopped this, right? So there's a bit of like sort of community shame there going on. I think that stops people from speaking out. They'd rather just be like, oh, that was a bad chapter of my life, move on, right? So there's that. The other thing, I think the other thing is culpability for individuals who have been in leadership. A lot of this stuff I've done, right?
Yeah.
I did it. I was the abuser. So now, and I mean that in a spiritual term. So now if I'm going to speak out against the danger, what I think is harmful, I have to sort of also take accountability for my share in that. And so I think that could get in the way. The other thing is, if you've been through the wholesale destruction of your faith and you have been through post-traumatic stress, you may not want to bring that on others. I certainly struggle with that. As much as I want people to have their psychological liberty, I think that needs to be something sought by the individual, which is why I don't need to speak out to Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. They may need help upon exit when they choose to, and that's where I think mental health professionals come in. But yeah, I know how traumatic that can be. I know how thin of a line that can be to walk when you feel like you've lost everything and you feel unsupported. So it could be concern that stops some, and it could be still a certain amount of shame. There could still be a certain amount of shame for having lost one's faith. There is a certain amount of psychological, we could even call it strength, to be able to keep up a lie. If you can stick with your bullshit long enough, there is a significant strength that sort of people who are held to their own honesty, they don't have that strength. It's difficult to keep up for some. And so for those who can keep it up, there's a power in that. There's a power in being able to, stick to your guns, even when you're withholding information. And so the leaders that fall away, they didn't cut the mustard. They couldn't hold on to, we call that holding on to faith. They lost their faith. Oh, like they weren't able to hang on to their faith, there's still perhaps shame and personal weakness there for not being able to hang on to this ideal.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my guess.
Totally
I don't know. I've never spoken to any of them, so that's my guess.
Yeah. I mean, elders who are, ex-witnesses or PIMOs, and, they come out and they blow the whistle and they leak documents. I mean, that is a very, very common thing, but it is very rare for circuit overseers and district overseers to do the same. I mean, I've encountered one or two on the ExJW Reddit forum, but they're very, very rare, very few and far between. So that was a really good question.
That's interesting. That is interesting. I haven't noticed that. Of course, they are rarer in general, right? There's not as many of them, and it will be harder for them to wake up. You have to also remember that circuit overseers there comes a point where you give more than just your sort of religious devotion to the organization, but also financial, right? Yeah. So the sort of vow of poverty that you sign, and then you enter into a financial relationship, you are particularly disempowered when you can't. How would you exit? You have no skills. You're past the point where you would have the money for an education. So this is a particular place of disempowerment that would be very, very difficult for some to be able to step away from.
That's very true. That's very true. And most overseers, circuit and district overseers, are in the later stages of their life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you start again at that age with from scratch?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, Anita has another question. Hi, Geoffrey. Are you in a strong JW family?
Yeah, definitely. Very strong. Yeah, involved multiple levels. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't like to. I was mentioning to Riley earlier, I don't like to speak too much about my family for sort of obvious reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Thank you. And Miss Bethany Headley asks, "What is your exit plan, Geoffrey? I'm having trouble leaving."
I used to give a lot of advice. I used to be an elder. I don't like to give advice anymore. I really don't. I like to sort of bow out there, but I will say that there are individuals that want to help on the outside. I think having a mental health counselor is hugely important, particularly somebody that understands religious trauma. Yeah. And so there's a lot of discussion in the ex-evangelical space, a lot of discussion in the ex-Mormon space of what it's like, how traumatic it is to leave, and to give you a safe space while you are exiting to figure out what you want to do and to figure out how you're going to build your life. So yeah, mental health counseling is huge. That way, there's an understanding in the mental health community of the limits of one's authority in terms of convincing you what to do and how you want to do it. And so most are able to step back and yield space so that you can create your own path. And so I think personal empowerment is really important. Emotional empowerment. I talk a lot in the book about mindfulness. I know that's another rabbit hole, but it did definitely help me to understand my emotional blind spots that were being filled by the group. So I started to understand, I turned to Jehovah with this concern, that concern, this concern, and that concern. I can't own those without the passive, being pacified by the religion. So let me see if I can sit with those and understand them and own them a little bit better, so that I can feel emotionally empowered. And then for some, it's, for others, it's financial empowerment. I think of individuals who are children in Jehovah's Witness families or teenagers. That's going to be about getting out on your own and making your own way. But yeah, if you feel that you don't have a voice, then get with a therapist, because there's all sorts of assertive communication skills that we weren't taught as Jehovah's Witnesses, about how to communicate needs, how to communicate desires, how to communicate our own thoughts in a way that isn't aggressive, how to be angry. Right? We're not taught how to be angry in Watchtower literature. It's a work of the flesh, but it's really not a work of the flesh. It's part of the natural landscape of human emotion. So learning how to express anger in a healthy way, but I certainly, for the commenter, seek help. Seek help from somebody that you can trust, a professional.
Thank you. That's very good advice. That's something that I'm always keen to advocate as well. Therapy is so important. It's so important. Could you tell us about, I mean, you do speak about this in the book. I mean, you go into great detail about your whole, waking up journey. But for the benefit of those who haven't read the book yet, and I do encourage all of you to read the book, could you just briefly tell us what was the spark that ignited your journey to waking up?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint it because it was incremental. As I said, I was reading a lot because I had a lot of downtime, and I had a job that was sort of not intellectually stimulating. I was reading a lot about other religions because I was trying to preach to them. I was trying to convince them that I had the truth. And so I was reading a lot about different religions, and I started to see how there were some real gnarly similarities between how I thought and how they think, particularly in like fundamentalist groups. And so I was reading a lot about fundamentalist religion, fundamentalist Islam, and some of the challenges that were being faced in Europe and in, the Syrian crisis and in the Levant there. So I was trying to understand what really made people think that way. And as I started to see similarities to the way that I think and the way that I use the Bible to convince people of the truth of what I do, and how I also use theology to abdicate responsibility for things that, maybe not in the best interest of humanity. So I was drawing these connections, and things started unraveling. And then, as I said, I was doing a lot of listening and reading, but it seemed like everywhere I turned, 20 pages into the book, I would rub up against something that would conflict with my theology, and I had to put the book down. And so that was getting untenable. But eventually, I was just getting by with like Xanax every day, going out and giving talks from the platform, just trying to numb all of my feelings so that I could give parts from the platform. I was getting trained for some bigger responsibilities, and I reached out to every mentor of stature in the group that I knew of, and everybody that I respected who had been my spiritual advisor, my spiritual teacher. I reached out to all of them. I discussed some of my concerns, and none of them could go there with me. None of them could sort of reckon with, some of what we're doing here could be considered harmful. And nobody could be honest like that with me. And there was a moment where I had to let go. I could no longer make excuses for my beliefs. I had to just let it go. And that was a panic-inducing. I remember that, a very panic-inducing moment. It's not nice to think about it. It is no less than traumatic. That's why I speak out, because when you do something like that and you have those sort of symptoms of trauma, panic attacks, and all that, you need to have some medical professionals with you too. For some.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had an experience like that myself. The first time that I watched an ExJW video on YouTube, I had a full-on anxiety attack.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sweating, hand shaking, everything.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a few more questions, please. Thank you, Geoffrey. A hitman rarely gives interviews when they change their life, even if they know where the bodies are buried, figuratively.
I guess I don't know.
So
I don't understand that question.
I think this was in reference to the earlier question about circuit overseers and district overseers not really
I see.
telling about their experience once they leave.
Yeah. Yep.
And Ronnie, hi Ronnie, how are you doing? It's good to see you here. Geoffrey, will you ever leave the organization or continue as a PIMO? How do you guard your mental health?
Yeah, I don't know what that looks like for me. Just at this point, it's a bit of a personal journey, which I'll keep to myself a bit. But in terms of my mental health, regular therapy is really important for me.
Mm.
I also set boundaries, and I have created a safety, at least in my own home, right, where the organization does not have dominion. And I think that's an important step for a PIMO, is to, there may still be some social obligations that you feel as yet you cannot let go of, but at least you can start creating a space of safety in your home, and so releasing obligation with the family to things like, the daily Bible reading and the daily text reading and the family worship and the watching this and the, those high demand requirements. You can start with some freedom in the home and then move from there. So that's very important to me. As I said before, mindfulness is really important. When for me has been super helpful when I'm in a situation that's causing me emotional discomfort, to be able to be an observer of my experience a little bit rather than feeling the need to react to it. So mindfulness allows you to step back, see what's going on in terms of your thoughts and your emotions, so that you can then separate from that a decision that is pragmatic for you, whether it's to leave or to stay, or to how to leave and how to stay, where the boundaries will be for you, how you can create some power. So mindfulness is super helpful for that, for me too.
Yeah, that's a great answer to that question. I mean, I've found mindfulness helpful as well. I really did like the part of your book where you touched on that as well. Speaking, if memory serves, you spoke about the different systems of the brain and how you're able to mentally detach yourself from what you're feeling and look at that experience from the perspective of another person who's not directly involved in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I mean, if you have, for example, if you're, the example we were talking about earlier, reading something that triggers a fear response, right? In that moment, you can say, okay, what am I experiencing? Where's that fear? Okay, I'm feeling that fear in my head. Maybe I'm feeling it in my stomach. I'm feeling all these sort of sensory experiences. Let me take a couple breaths and see if there's any sort of cognitive correlates. Are there any thoughts occurring in my mind that are connected to that fear? And sometimes you can experience that connection, like, oh, this is because I'm really afraid. I'm remembering that time when I was 8 and I saw my first disfellowshipping of, somebody that was my family's best friend, and it scared the heck out of me. And I'm still remembering that fear in this moment. So then now you can separate from that, revisit it. Okay, well, now I'm an adult. I have some agency. I can decide what I want to do here. It would be hard if I did this or that. You can make some pragmatic decisions, or you can choose to ignore it, but at least you have some awareness of your experience. And definitely emotions and thoughts can get confused. This is something that they do with EDMR therapy too, where they'll ask you to experience a feeling, maybe it's a feeling of shame or self-hatred. And then they will sort of maybe use their finger or something to guide your eyes and distract you a little bit away from the feeling, and then ask you what thought came to mind. So you start to recognize that most of your emotional experience is connected with a thought, perhaps a thought that is sort of in the unconscious mind that you don't see readily right away. But taking some time, breathing through those experiences allows you to really parse apart what's going on in your mind and seeing some of the subconscious information that is part of the programming of the theology and your environment growing up.
No, that's really good. I have one last question for you, and then we're going to take some more questions from viewers, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So my question for you is there anything that you do now or that you experience that you would not have been able to do when you were a witness that have brought some kind of positive aspect to your life?
The biggest thing has to be finally being able to read anything that I want to read, and I can sit with anybody and I can experience their opinion without feeling threatened. And that's so liberating, knowing that you can still hold on to how you think and what you feel and your values in the presence of anybody. That's healthy. That's a healthy self, right? That's a healthy individual self. And that's super liberating. Being able to think, being able to create more freely is that's made a huge difference to my life.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, something that I personally really enjoy now is being able to have friendly conversations with strangers without there being an ulterior motive on my part or fear that this person is a potential spiritual danger as well. Just being able to converse with people without either of those things coming into play is really, really enjoyable.
It really is. It's taught me a lot about prejudice in general, and the experience of fear and prejudice and why it happens and what it feels like to try and break away from it. Because as a Jehovah's Witness, we're raised with just such a firm prejudice against outsiders. A belief that, it's explicit, right? That they are possibly under the influence of Satan. But I found that even after I no longer believed in Satan, I still had a fear of outsiders because of cultural differences, language differences, and things like that. And so being able to, as you say, being able to feel free around other people and to not live in such a small world, such a small microcosm of the universe, and being able to experience other people and different experiences and different opinions and different ways of thinking is part of the beauty of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you. So let's take some more questions, just a few. Anita, has Geoffrey started to make friends outside of the organization?
Friends? What are those? Yes. Yeah. It's an interesting experience, right? Because intimacy is automatic in the organization. You're both Jehovah's Witnesses, so you know that you think exactly the same. So I find that intimacy is a bit artificial in the organization in that it happens immediately and you can become closely attached, perhaps even unhealthily attached, very, very quickly when you have that common spiritual understanding. That's what the organization will refer to as unity and brotherhood. But when you're actually making friends without that sort of, being part of the same religion, friendship is a lot different. Friendship is about sort of slowly building trust, slowly sharing parts of yourself with others. And that is something that needs to be learned. Really, it's like a new skill to be learned. For me, it's something that I've been learning about a lot, much past the curve in terms of my developmental age. I'm learning what it means to make a friend. But, then you have a different sort of loyalty. It's an individual loyalty. And you start to realize that friends can be made regardless of what they believe and regardless of the choices they make. Friendship underlies some of these things. And who knew? Who knew?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the organization, you become friends purely because of proximity. It's like you get to the destination without going on the journey.
Yeah. Well put.
Okay. TW asks, did the elder body treat poor members differently from wealthier members in the congregation?
I never experienced that.
Okay.
No, I didn't experience that.
Okay, thank you. And Sparkle Canada asks, have you read any of Stephen Hassan's books about cults and how to leave a cult or help others leave?
Oh my goodness, you're gonna get me in so much trouble because I'm with Stephen Hassan for the I Got Out project. I'm like a fellow collaborator there, and so we were on a Zoom meeting just a couple weeks ago. But I have read some of his blog posts, but I haven't read his books. You know, I'm familiar with his bite model, which I think is really important. It's
Yeah,
it's sort of a little bit more straightforward than something like Lifton's ideological totalism. But I
yeah,
know his work has been really important for a lot of people leaving a lot of different groups.
yeah, I agree completely. It was really, really important and helpful to me
Yeah.
personally.
But don't tell him I said that, please.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions, if there are any. Hey, Miss Bethany Headley, I find friendships outside the organization are hard, but I think it's because I have trust issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
and one of if you haven't read "Leaving the Fold" by Marlene Winnell, that's really important for recoverers for religious trauma. She talks about betrayal trauma, and I've written about this too. How you trust with all your might in an organization, and then it betrays you. It doesn't give you the full truth. It has been coercive in the way it treated you. It manipulated you, and those are all the humans you knew. All the humans you
mm,
know are Jehovah's Witnesses. So you have no experiential evidence that humans are not that, right? Let's just be honest with ourselves. You, as yet, do not have evidence that humans are trustworthy. So I cannot try and tell you right now that they are. It's something that you'll have to experience. I have faith that they are, but my experience is still building up too because I'm in sort of the same situation, right? Um,
yeah,
but you're absolutely right. It shakes your trust in humanity at large, um, and that is a wound that needs to be recovered from. Check out some stuff on betrayal trauma. Um, check out Marlene Winnell's work. She's got some great discussions of that.
great, thank you. Okay, so one final question. Uh, Question for Geoffrey. So you don't believe in Satan. Would you say you are atheist, agnostic, or how are you leaning? And does your family have any clue that you're having doubts?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely atheist slash agnostic at this point. Um, I can't be really dogmatic about the lack of existence, the non-existence of God. I can't be dogmatic about it. I find in that dogmatism, I start feeling like a Jehovah's Witness again in
Yeah,
terms of my rigidity. And
yeah,
so I can't be real dogmatic about that. Um, but in terms of, oh yeah, I mean, I take a more secular approach. I find that very liberating to lean into sexual. Well, that too, but secular thought has been a big, relief because you can see that other side of the coin, and it's important to
yeah,
balance that with spirituality always, because it keeps one foot in the ground. And really, I think our minds are both sort of these secular materialistic things and also these spiritual, that sort of conflict is what is the human experience. In terms of my family, they have only seen how I have stepped away from the things that I used to do for the organization, and probably don't always understand how that is. However, I know that there was a time before I made those decisions where I attempted to communicate it to them, but mainly on deaf ears. There's a time where you have to own that for yourself, and I think that's part of the growth pattern away from this too. Is owning one's values in the absence of validation.
very true, very true. So, lastly, please tell us how we can read your book.
Yeah, the book is on Amazon. Also, so you can get a paperback or the ebook, and then also you can get the audiobook too. So we finished that up a month or so ago. So that's available. Yeah. Should be it's on Audible, and I think it should be in Google and other places, iTunes too.
Great, thank you so much. And yes, there are links to the book in the description of this video as well. So Geoffrey, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this evening.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's been great.
No problem. Thank you. The honor's all mine. And thank you, viewers, for watching. If you haven't already done so, please like the video and subscribe to the channel with notifications so that you'll be alerted whenever I publish a new video. Please proceed to the exit in an orderly fashion, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching to the very end of the video. If you haven't already done so, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you like my work and want to help me continue doing it, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Jexit_2020.